Well, welcome, Swami. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here with you. And I'm sure you have any number of fascinating things to say about Vedanta and related subjects. My understanding of Vedanta is that one of its principal concerns is consciousness and the nature of consciousness. Could you begin by defining what consciousness is?
Yes, thank you very much for having me here this morning, Richard. And you've started with the most difficult question. What is consciousness? I'll start with an anecdote of my own. A friend of mine, a monk, we are talking about consciousness studies, the modern discipline of consciousness studies, which is an interdisciplinary thing, actually. He said, that's not a mature field. And I asked him, why do you say that? And he said, because you can't define what you're working on. So in consciousness studies, it's a struggle to define what consciousness is. But in Vedanta, there are actually very elegant ways of getting around this. So for example, um, consciousness is defined as not this, not this. In Sanskrit, anidam chaitanyam. What that means is, when we look at it phenomenologically in our own experience, the way we experience life, whatever we can categorize as this in our experience is not consciousness. So, um, consciousness is that which is aware of the this, or which illumines or reveals the this. So, for example, this world, this table, this chair, this world, so it's not consciousness. It's in the realm of an object of consciousness. Then this body, clearly the body is an object because I can refer to the body as this. I can see it, I can touch it, I can, all the senses operate on the body, so it's a this. And even more interesting, most especially, it's very interesting that the mind too, we can refer to the mind as this. So when we introspect, we are aware of our own mental states. We are aware of our thoughts. We are aware of our emotions, how we feel. We are aware of pain or suffering. So our sensations, judgments, memories, intellectual cognitions, all of this comes under the category of this. So the entire range of objects, starting with the physical world, um, which includes this body, but also our mental world of the mind, all of this you can put under the category of this. And that which knows this is consciousness. So it's a sort of an analytic knife in which you distinguish our original intuition of the subject and the object. When we can put it this way, when we evacuate from the subject anything that is object and leave the bare subject, which cannot be denied. I mean, a la Descartes. So we do exist, and it's an aware existence. So that awareness to which the entire spectrum of the this appears is consciousness. You notice it's a negative way of defining consciousness. Instead of saying what consciousness is, we have just said what it is not. And then we are expected to catch it intuitively because we are consciousness. So it should be obvious to us. Another way, a recent way I heard, the philosopher Arindam Chakravarti was a brilliant mind working in Indian philosophy. He has quite a way with words. So he defined consciousness, he defined object. So he said, an object is anything that objects to your consciousness. So that's another way of defining consciousness. I could go on. Let me just end with a reference to the original sources of Vedanta, the Upanishads. So if you ask the Upanishads, how would you define consciousness? One of the Upanishads, the Kena Upanishad, defines consciousness as the ear of the ear, the eye of the eye, the mind of the mind, and so on.
That's fascinating. I mean, it makes me think of the etymology of the word object, which comes from the Latin obicio, which means to throw in front of. So an object is something that is thrown in front of you. And that really seems very much like what you've been saying over the last few minutes.
That's
Uh,
very interesting. All right, I'll add it to my repertoire of definitions of consciousness.
okay.
Thank you.
Well, another major concern of the Vedanta is Atman. And you've just discussed the nature of consciousness. So Is Vedanta calling what you've just defined as consciousness Atman?
You have put it very elegantly. In fact, all of Vedanta can be, at least most of it, the fundamental insight of Vedanta can be characterized as Atman is equal to consciousness. Now, Atman means self. And why Vedanta was interested in the self, the broader question is what was the general project of Indian thought from the most ancient times, from the Vedic times, through Vedanta and allied and rival systems, Buddhism, Jainism, and all of that. The concern was overcoming suffering, attainment of fulfillment or bliss. So dukkha, suffering, that was the Buddha's prime concern, for example. All of these systems of thought and practice, they all claim that suffering can be overcome. The problem of suffering can be solved at a fundamental level. And suffering, of course, relates to the suffering self. I suffer, we suffer. So the question became, what is this self which suffers? And each of these systems has a theory of the self. In Vedanta, it was immediately noticed that the self and consciousness go together. So the consciousness became an integral part of the definition of the self. We ended up with consciousness is equal to self. In Sanskrit, chaitanyam or chit is equal to the Atman.
You are an exponent of Advaita Vedanta, and Advaita means non-dual. And my understanding of it in this context is that there is no essential distinction between Atman and Brahman.
That's right, Richard. Let me back up a little bit and say Vedanta, the word itself, it means literally, it means the end of the Vedas. The Vedas being the primal or the primordial, the root texts of Hinduism. A bulk of the Vedas are rituals, texts related to the performance of the fire rituals, which are somewhat obsolete. I'm saying somewhat carefully because nothing is really obsolete in Hinduism. Everything survives in some form or the other. But the important part of the Vedas are the final texts in the Vedas, which are called Upanishads. And these are sometimes located at the end of the Vedic texts, but not always, sometimes in the middle of that. So the Vedanta is the end of the Vedas in the sense that it is the final or the highest philosophical, spiritual teachings of the Vedas. It's the end, um, in different senses. The edge, somebody defined it as the cutting edge of the of the Vedanta, or the edge, as in the razor's edge. Somerset Maugham wrote that beautiful novel, The Razor's Edge, and the term is actually taken from the Upanishads, from Vedanta. The spiritual path is supposed to be as delicate and difficult and sharp as a razor's edge. So Vedanta is that edge, is that final or the highest teachings of the Vedas. And the root texts are the Upanishads, which are parts of the Vedas. But over the centuries and indeed millennia, multiple schools have emerged based on different interpretations of these Upanishads. And so Vedanta has many schools, one of which is what you just now referred to as Advaita Vedanta, non-dual Vedanta. That's my home tradition too. But I must acknowledge that there are multiple other schools of Vedanta. There are these, I think that's all right. So there are dualistic schools, there are quasi-monastic schools. I mean, if I give you a list of the names of the schools of Vedanta, one will immediately get a sort of bird's eye view of what's going on here. There is Advaita Vedanta, of course, non-dual Vedanta, which we are going to talk about. But there is Dvaita Vedanta, which means dualistic Vedanta. There is Vishishta Dvaita Vedanta, which means qualified monastic Vedanta. There is Dvaita Vedanta, which means dual and non-dual Vedanta. There is the school of Shuddha pure non-dual Vedanta, which if you actually study it, it becomes a pure dualistic system. Then there is Achintya Bheda Bheda, which translates into the incomprehensible identity of difference and non-difference. So this gives you even the names of the schools gives you a general idea of what's going on here. Um, when I must flag this, when we talk about dual, non-dual, qualified, monastic, and all of that, we're talking about metaphysical categories. How many ultimate realities are there? So the non-dual school, as the name indicates, there is no two. Ultimately, it is all one without a second. The dualistic school insists that there is that God, the sentient beings, and this insentient universe, they're all different categories. There are significant and irreducible differences among them. The qualified monastic school teaches that there is an organic whole, there is one divine unity, but in that unity there are differences. So it's like a body. So body is one, but definitely there are differences between my hands and my feet and my head and my tummy. Like that, the universe is one divine unity, and that divine unity is Brahman, the God, if you will. But within this divine unity, there are internal differences between sentient beings like us and tables and chairs and so on. Although all of it together is God. But there's a clear difference between this and non-dualism. Non-dualism says not only is it one, there is no internal difference whatsoever. So therefore comes the theory of Maya, which means an appearance. Um, that we experience a variety, a plurality of entities, tables and chairs, cats and dogs, human beings, quasars and quarks, and so on. There's no denying that we experience this difference. What non-duality says is that this difference is only apparent, and underlying this difference is a non-difference. So it's not a real difference, whereas the qualified monastic school insists there's a real difference, but the non-dual school says that the difference is only in appearance. So their formulation there's a classic formulation of the non-dual school. Brahman is the only reality. The non-dual Brahman is the only reality. The world of differences is an appearance. And you, the sentient being, you are that Brahman. So this is the stunning claim of Advaita Vedanta, that you are the ultimate reality. But then again, we have to be very careful about what's meant by you and what's meant by the ultimate reality and what's meant by the identity of you and the ultimate reality. I mean, there is a statement, Tat Tvamasi, very well known. You are that. So there are books and books written on that. You are that. But all of Advaita Vedanta is an exercise in understanding what is meant by you, what is meant by that, and what is meant by that are, the identity of you and that.
One impression I have is that a difference between Advaita and Dvaita Vedanta is the existence of something called Ishvara, kind of a personal God who can be the object of devotion in the religious sense, even as Western religions experience God. And Advaita is saying that really there's no such thing as Ishvara. Is that correct at all?
That's sometimes the impression that's given, and I think Advaitins are partly to blame for it, and the opponents of the non-dualists are more to blame for it. The opponents being the various dualistic schools of Vedanta, which engaged with Advaita over centuries of debate, back and forth. And that was one of the charges laid at the door of the non-dualists. First of all, are these guys even religious? They seem to be a particularly nefarious band of atheists who are denying the existence of God. And what was worse, from the dualistic point of view, not only do these guys deny the existence of God, but they commit the ultimate blasphemy of saying, I am God. So this is what the Advaitins had to respond to. Yes, it's not very difficult to understand the dualistic schools of Vedanta. I mean, you just have to look around in the world of religions. It's pretty much standard. There is God, an ultimate reality, and the definition of that God actually conforms to the definition of God in more or less every tradition in the world, that God is the creator of this universe, the creator, preserver, and ultimately the destroyer of this universe. So Hindus believe in cycles, cyclic existence. So the universe is created, it exists for billions and billions of years, then it's dissolved and then created again, and we go through these cycles of creation, existence, dissolution. And the power behind all of it is God. So that is the dualistic position. And we sentient beings, we are different from God, and therefore, being different, the way out, the religious thing to do is to establish a relationship with God. And this relationship, which can only be a relationship of faith and surrender and devotion and worship, um, never identity. This is the devotional way, the dualistic Vedanta. To understand that, if somebody is familiar with Christianity or Judaism or Islam, one can immediately see what is being said here. It's pretty much in the same template. Advaita Vedanta there is pretty radical. It says, so the interesting thing about Advaita Vedanta's position on God is that it does not really deny God. The position of Advaita Vedanta is that it subsumes the dualistic religion or the theistic religion. What Advaita Vedanta says is we are not even denying the world. We're not even denying our own existence. We are not even denying the existence of God, but rather what we are doing is explaining it. For the first time, we begin to understand that there is an underlying reality, which is a non-dual reality, which appears to us as God, world, and individual. Now, in the world of appearance, Advaita Vedanta is fully willing to admit, not only admit, in fact, support and encourage theistic religion, a religion of faith and devotion and worship, which Advaita Vedanta says is of great help in ultimately attaining the non-dual realization. So the classical Advaita Vedanta would always, it would be make it hierarchical. Brahman is the ultimate reality, or you can say it is the underlying reality of which the world, individuals, and God are appearances. At the level of appearance, your dualistic religion, in fact, Advaita Vedanta is pretty non-committal that way. It was in classical India about 1,000 years back. It was the Advaitins who were very eclectic, very ecumenical, if you will. They are very happy if you worship Shiva, if you worship God as the Divine Mother, if you worship God as Vishnu. The sects had rivalries among each other, but the non-dualists, because of this hierarchy, the higher truth and lower truth, or if the underlying truth and the appearance, the reality and appearance, what you do in appearance, to use an Americanism, knock yourself out. we are all right with it, and it's all very good. Worship Vishnu if you will, worship Shiva if you will, but then you would have to look deeper than that and come to the non-dual Brahman if you truly wanted liberation here and now, because only the truth will set you free. So the truth being that there is this non-dual Brahman, and you are that non-dual Brahman. That has to be realized. So that was the position, and has even now the orthodox non-dualists have this position. But there are many, many teachers, for example, in our tradition, Sri Ramakrishna, who flattens that hierarchy, who would say if you eat a pie, or the Bengali equivalent of a pie, he would say you eat it this way, or you eat it that way, or you eat it the other way, it tastes the same. You are experiencing the same thing. So approach that divinity in a dualistic mode of devotion or a non-dualistic mode of knowledge, self-realization, you are getting in touch with the same reality. So there is no need to, put up a hierarchy. He would say that if those who are the way of knowledge, they realize I am Brahman, and they are free. But those who don't knock the devotees, the lovers of God, they worship God as my beloved father or mother, and they also attain to freedom. Just that their path is different.
Well, it's interesting because comparing what you say to the Christian tradition, obviously it is Dvaita all the way, except with the visions of some mystics like Meister Eckhart, who posited this Godhead that was beyond God. And Meister Eckhart, like a lot of Christians who did this, got into trouble, and he had the good luck to die before the Inquisition got after him. But a lot of Christian theology is like sometimes an even rather pathetic attempt to keep insisting on this radical bridge. And I mean, it's interesting to see that in this tradition, this duality is kind of accepted, but it's not shall we say, battleground. So that's really very helpful. So in short, you're saying that Advaita Vedanta would admit bhakti yoga, as it's called, devotion to a deity, as you say, Vishnu or Shiva, as an acceptable religious practice for those that are disposed to it. Is that right?
Absolutely. And the Advaita teachers who came to the West, for example, Swami Vivekananda, who founded the Vedanta Society I'm in now, and others who have come over the last century or more, they have extended the same courtesy to the non-Hindu religions. So if you're devoted to Christ, to the Father in heaven, wonderful. And not only that, you should continue with that devotion. If you are a Muslim and you're devoted to Allah, that's also wonderful. But notice the classical teachers of Advaita would make a hierarchy. So they would put not in a dismissive way, in fact, in a very helpful way, that the devotion to God in your tradition is to be encouraged and practiced, that prepares the mind for the higher non-dual knowledge. Just a word about Meister Eckhart and others. You're right. This non-dual intuition, if you will, it's been there among the spiritual masters of, I would say, every major religious tradition in the world. Meister Eckhart, very notably, when I read Meister Eckhart, I feel I'm reading non-dualism, Advaita, literally. I mean, he puts it so beautifully. For example, he says, the ground of God and the ground of my soul are one and the same ground. This is literally, you are that. What Vedanta talks about, you are that. It's a very good analysis of what is meant by that, what is meant by you, and the identity of you and that. The ground of my soul and the ground of God are the same ground. Islamic mystics, some of them, who say, there was one who said, when I look for Allah, when I search for Allah, I found myself. And when I search for myself, I found Allah. It's exactly the same statement once again. But again, you're right. These mystics have been marginalized at best and persecuted at worst. Whereas in Hinduism, what happened was this non-dual tradition became mainstream. And Hinduism has multiple mainstreams. So there is definitely mainstream dualistic bhakti traditions, devotional traditions, but also the non-dual tradition. And one great saving factor in India from the most ancient times was religious rivalries and these conflicts were thankfully kept on the intellectual plane. So they had these extraordinary system of debates. And I always say that the Hinduism is the world's largest disorganized religion. So being that as an advantage, you don't get persecuted, and there is no overarching dogma or orthodoxy which everybody else has to follow. You can have multiple orthodoxies, and the place for new teachers is always there. So yeah, that's what enabled non-dualism to become mainstream and not be persecuted in the Hindu context.
Well, another kind of perspective of the Hindu tradition is Samkhya, which is another one of the 6 darshans of the Vedic tradition. Obviously, it's distinguished from Vedanta because they are different darshans. I happened to get a new copy of a translation of the Sankhya Karika in a few days ago, and I've been reading that. And maybe you could tell me, as a matter of personal interest, where Advaita Vedanta kind of jives with the Sankhya and where it may differ.
Yes, that's a very good question, because Sankhya is one of the closest to Advaita Vedanta. And there's a lot that Advaita takes from Sankhya. Actually, Sankhya chronologically is probably older than what we call Advaita Vedanta now, because the Sankhyan texts, the one you referred to, Ishvara Krishna's Sankhya Karika, that's the oldest authentic text available. There are other texts which claim to be older, but probably not. They're probably reconstructions of lost texts. but the Sankhya Karika is definitely very ancient. Now, the Sankhya is one of the so-called orthodox systems of Hindu philosophy, the six systems. The Nyaya school, which specialized in logic, the Vaisheshika school, which specialized in metaphysics, a pluralistic metaphysics, the Sankhya school, which was frankly dualistic, a spiritual nature and a material nature, consciousness and matter, being irreducible. Then the Yoga school, which refers to Patanjali's yoga, which specialized in developing meditation techniques. Then there's the school of the Purva Mimamsa, which specialized in ritualism and developed a philosophy and theory of language based on Vedic ritualism. And then the Uttara Mimamsa, which is another name for which is Vedanta. And in that Vedanta, you have multiple schools like I listed earlier, and one of which is Advaita Vedanta. So this is the relationship between Sankhya and Advaita Vedanta. They are part of Orthodox Hinduism, but Advaita Vedanta is part of the Vedanta group of schools, and Sankhya is an older, let us say, sibling of these schools. Practically, however, it is Vedanta which rules the roost, because if you look at actual practicing Hindus, they'll probably belong to some school of Vedanta, mostly to a devotional school. If you go to a Hindu temple and you're confronted with this bewildering array of deities, and if you look deeper, what are the texts, what's the philosophy behind it, you will find some school of Vedanta, mostly a dualistic devotional school of Vedanta. So what are the similarities and dissimilarities? The first big similarity is in the conception of consciousness or pure consciousness. According to Sankhya and according to Advaita Vedanta, there is a reality called pure consciousness, which is just bare consciousness or bare awareness. It is fundamental, it's irreducible, and we are that. Both Sankhya and Advaita would say, who am I? We are not bodies, we are not minds, we are consciousness. We are beings of pure awareness or pure light, if you will. Yes, endowed with bodies and minds. And the differences, yes, both in Sankhya and Advaita, enlightenment would constitute realizing that we are this pure consciousness, correcting the error that we are bodies and minds, and realizing that we are pure consciousness. Another great similarity between Sankhya and Advaita would be the primary method of spiritual practice, if you will, is a philosophical inquiry. We actually sit and take a good hard look at ourselves with the question, who am I? And there are methods of inquiry. There are procedures which you follow and come to the realization, oh, I am this witness consciousness. I am not the body, not the mind. I am the witness, the awareness, which is the witness of the body-mind. Differences. Now, in Sankhya, the object, the material universe, all of that is put under the category Prakriti, which literally means nature, material nature. And Prakriti is an independent reality, which operates in cooperation with consciousness. So consciousness and nature, Prakriti and Purusha. Nature is Prakriti and Purusha is consciousness. These are the ultimate realities in Sankhya, in the Sankhya system. And it is Prakriti which evolves into this physical universe, stars and planets, and also our bodies, and also, interestingly, the mental universe. So the mental universe is not conscious. It is endowed with consciousness because of our presence. It's because you are embodied in that body and mind. That's why that body and mind shine with awareness and consciousness. That's your light. And the body and the mind are more like chariots, to borrow an Upanishadic metaphor, a vehicle for you, the consciousness. Whereas in Advaita Vedanta, this material universe is not seen as an independent reality. It's seen as a power of consciousness. Maya is the same Prakriti, but it's merged into consciousness. It is consciousness itself through the power of Maya, which appears as the objective universe. So here's a very big difference. Here in Sankhya, you have a material order and a spiritual or consciousness, spiritual order or consciousness, and they interact. Where do they interact? Us. We are where they interact. The consciousness and bodies and minds interacting, and with the external universe. So on this side is all matter, all nature, and on this side is all consciousness. And they interact. Whereas Advaita would say this material universe is not an independent universe. In fact, Shankara, in his commentaries on Advaita, he starts with this. He questions. That's where he really targets Sankhya. He knows that to make his case, he just has to take one step beyond Sankhya. So his entire focus is on Sankhya. And he challenges Sankhya that how do they interact? The old interactionism problem. If you have a thoroughgoing duality, if they're so utterly different from each other, how would they even come in contact and interact with each other? This is something that Descartes also had to face, the mind-body dualism. But here is a much deeper dualism. Descartes' body, world, mind, all of them would come under the category of nature in Sankhya. And pure consciousness is the witness of that. But how do they interact? And Shankara's, the Advaita's answer is they don't. They don't interact. It's in fact consciousness alone which is appearing as the object, as the material universe. So it's actually in principle one reality. It is only consciousness. So the problem of interaction is solved. There's a word adhyasa in Sanskrit. A very good English translation would be superimposition. Imposition is when you put something on top of the other. Superimposition is when we mistake one thing for the other. So the classic example of mistaking the rope for a snake. We are mistaking the pure consciousness for this objective universe. So the rope being pure consciousness and the snake, so-called snake, being this world which seems to exist apart from us. So what Advaita does is it reduces the material universe back into you, the consciousness. We are nothing. This universe is nothing but us. We are appearing to ourselves much like a dream, for example, in which the dreamer appears as the dream world and also the person in the dream world who's experiencing the dream world. Both the subject and object are actually appearances of an underlying reality. That's what Advaita claims. A further claim of Advaita is that there are no multiple consciousnesses. So backing up, Sankhya says we are all different selves. There are innumerable Purushas, innumerable consciousnesses, if you will. Where Advaita Vedanta says you can't distinguish one consciousness from another. So consciousness by itself is just one. And it appears to be many in conjunction with multiple bodies and minds. So these are the main differences between Sankhya and Advaita Vedanta. Material nature is not independent according to Advaita. It is a power or a manifestation of the spiritual nature. So there's a non-dual spirituality. That's what. So you can see it's pretty intuitive. All of us experience the world as subjects and objects. That's the standard paradigm for everybody. And Sankhya just makes a philosophy out of it. Says that the subject is really pure consciousness, and that's what we truly are. And the object is everything else. And our problem is mixing up the two. We must separate the two, and then we see that as pure consciousness, we are fine. We are free. We have no problems at all. So the separation of pure consciousness from its objective component is Sankhya. And separation in enlightenment, not forcibly physical separation or anything. Whereas Advaita Vedanta would say the realizing the non-duality of your spiritual nature, that is enlightenment. And Sankhya insists multiple selves. Advaita says that's only apparent. The self is one reality, that one non-dual Brahman. So this is the similarity and difference in Sankhya. But Advaita Vedanta clearly owes a lot to Sankhya.
Well, thank you. That's very illuminating. To go to a more practical day-to-day level, could you discuss some of the spiritual meditative practices taught by Advaita Vedanta?
Yes. So there was a common basis of practice. All of these schools, Advaita included, they realized the importance of ethics. So to put it this way, you can't have God without the good. One must try to move from an immoral life to a moral life, from an adharmic life to a dharmic life. And on that basis, progress to higher realms of spirituality. That's one thing. So strict morality. which would include truth and self-control and compassion. And so all of these systems have their codes of morality, without which you can't be spiritual. Then the next level was that all of these schools realized the importance of training the body-mind. So especially the mind. Some of these schools also train the body, especially the yoga school. They train the body to be what is called sattvic, a pure body. They were the physical side of yoga. Of course, one doesn't have to belabor the point. It's a worldwide phenomenon, thanks to America now. So what generally the world knows as yoga is the physical side of it. But the mental side of it is purifying the mind and controlling the mind, which is where meditation comes in. A wide range of meditative techniques were discovered. Both the Sankhyans and the Advaitins realized philosophy is fine, a philosophical inquiry is fine, but with a flickering and unstable mind, a mind plagued by lust and greed and jealousy and anger and guilt, it won't work. It's like pouring water on a steaming hot pan. It'll just flash and evaporate into steam. So you have to cool down the mind first. The mind has to be concentrated. So techniques of concentration and focus were developed over centuries. So the Hindus had multiple traditions in yoga, in tantra. The Buddhists developed obviously a huge range of techniques, including mindfulness, which is very big now. But these are the context of all of these were as methods for enlightenment, not for stress busting or reducing wrinkles or looking young. Those are all good byproducts, but that was not the point of these techniques. And as I said earlier, Advaita also recommends a devotional practice. Whichever devotional tradition you belong to, it should be continued. It's very helpful. And then one engages in the final Advaitic practices of Shravana, Manana, Nididhyasana, which literally translates into listening, reasoning, and meditating, which is nothing very esoteric. It's to put it very simply, it's just like how we learn stuff at school or university. You go and listen to the professor, you read the handouts which are given and the textbooks, then you think upon it, and once clarity is there, you stay with that clarity, you sit with it until you get a breakthrough. So that's listening, reasoning, meditating in Advaita Vedanta. You notice meditating has come in at two levels. One is at the level of training the mind, and one at the level of non-dual realization. So to go a little deeper into the Advaitic practice of listening, reasoning, and meditating, listening is supposed to answer the question, what is non-duality? What are these texts teaching me? At the end of my listening, I should be able to say now, oh, I see, the Upanishads and the Gita and the Brahma Sutras and other texts are telling me that I am Brahman, and I understand what is meant by I understand what is meant by Brahman, I understand what is meant by am. So this becomes clear, the texts become clear, I have the information now. That's step one. Step two is, I have the information, but I have many questions. I'm not the body mind. What do you mean I'm not why am I not the body? Why am I not the mind? What is this pure consciousness? I can have many questions. Why can't I say that this pure consciousness is just a byproduct of the brain, which is what most scientists and doctors will ask you now. Why not? So all kinds of questions, some of which come up because we don't understand what the texts are telling us, some of which come up from opposing systems of thought. And all of them have to be answered till we get clarity on what the texts are teaching us. Once the clarity is obtained, once the questions have been answered, now the next problem will be, I get it, and I am now sold on it. I understand non-dual Vedanta. I realize I am the Brahman, but it's just not living for me. I mean, I'm still the same guy, as Americans would say. You're still the same dude. If the goal was overcoming suffering, the goal was finding this choiceless, limitless bliss and fulfillment. Well, I'm not getting it. Now, the final stage is assimilating what has dawned upon me, the clarity, staying with it, and most importantly, living it. So not only meditating upon it, trying to live as if you are limitless consciousness in this body and mind, acting through this body and mind, which is of what is called the Jivan Mukta, the free while living, which we call enlightened. The enlightened masters are supposed to be like that. Not that a free while living, a Jivan Mukta has to be a master. They may teach, they may not teach. There is no limitation on such people, such a being after enlightenment. So this is the whole spiritual journey, from morality to devotional practices, supplemented by mind training in the form of yoga, to the core practice in Advaita Vedanta, which is listening, reasoning, and meditating. And it can take lifetimes.
Well, thank you. That's very comprehensive. One thing about present-day discourse is that you are hearing a great deal about non-duality in all sorts of contexts. Like, for example, I believe there's an annual science and non-duality conference somewhere or another. So all of these times when non-duality is used, and it is used very often, how close would you say it is to what Advaita means by non-duality?
Oh, that's a big question. And I know what you're referring to. I attended one of those conferences. It's called the SAND, and it was in the Bay Area in California. Yes. So it's become fashionable, non-duality. Advaita Vedanta is one non-dual tradition. We we tend to think of ourselves as the non-dual tradition, but in Hinduism itself, or in Indian thought itself, there are multiple non-dual traditions. There's a book, the Advaita tradition in Indian philosophy, and the author there, Chandradhar Sharma, who was a professor of philosophy in the 60s and 70s, I think, he considers, if I remember correctly, four systems of thought as non-dual. First, of course, Advaita Vedanta, but then the Kashmir Shaiva tradition, which is where your book actually is tangentially related to that tradition of Shiva playing dice with the Divine Mother, how consciousness creates the universe. He considers, so that is also a non-dual tradition. It's a non-duality of Shiva. Then he takes up two Buddhist traditions as non-dual traditions, the mind-only school, the Vijnanavada or Chittamatra school, the mind-only school, and the emptiness people, the Shunyavada school, the school of emptiness. So these are all varieties of non-dual philosophies, systems of thought going back thousands of years, between 1,000 to 3 or 4,000, 3,000 years at least. So these are the ancient schools of non-duality. And they were pluralistic schools, they were dualistic schools in Indian thought. Now, of course, there's an explosion of non-duality. There's non-dual love and non-dual management and non-dual this and non-dual that and non-dual science and non-dual healing, which is very American. And I think it has advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are the more you spread it widely and keep it open, the more chance there is of innovation and of people deriving what benefit they might from these various things. And the disadvantage is obvious. People lose sight of the authentic traditions. And there may be alleys and byways which may not lead to such good places. So one has to, I think a good way is to check if there is a lineage, if there is a textual tradition of, or is this person who's teaching non-duality a fly-by-night operator, I would ask, so what's the tradition you're teaching? What tradition are you part of? Which texts are you referring to? So that I can take a look for myself. And if you say, no, it's something that I have come up with, this non-dual meditation, which I am selling this year, is the latest version of non-duality, you could be right. Who knows? But I would always flag it with some, buyer beware, a caveat emptor there.
Well, of course, what you say makes one think of various supposedly spontaneously self-enlightened masters who go on and teach and whatnot. And, I'm not going to mention any names, but sometimes they seem a little bit off, but maybe that's just my impression. Well, how do you see Advaita permeating American culture? I mean, it obviously has had some real impact. The deepest teachings are probably not that well absorbed, but could you comment a little on the general sociological impact of Advaita Vedanta um, since the coming of Vivekananda, 125 years ago?
Yes. Before I get to that, could I just make a couple of observations
Sure.
about what you talked about enlightened masters? There is actually a very helpful definition of who is a master, who can be a teacher in the Upanishads, in the original Advaitic Vedantic texts. The words used are Shrotriya, Akamahata, Brahmanishta. Three qualifications which you have to look for. Whether a person is very interesting, whether a person is enlightened or not, we can't judge. It's an internal thing. So what can we judge? One is Shrotriya, which literally means a master of the texts. Shruti means the Upanishads. We can make it a little more broad. Are you a master of some lineage or the other? Do you know the texts and the teaching tradition of your lineage at least? So that's an important thing. Or is it entirely made up? I mean, it's coming from you. It could be authentic, but I would like to know if you are not only a part of a tradition, but are you a master of that tradition? That means, do you have a textual tradition to transmit to me? Teachings which you can transmit to me. That's one. It's a good check. Second is akamahata, which literally means not damaged by desire. So the master to whom I go should have no other motive except my welfare. He's not in it for making $1 million. He's not in it for glamour or cult-like power, which are often what you see. The cult of godmen. You have, like a person. And it's so strange. If non-dual Vedanta is the most impersonal thing that there could be. So certainly if somebody is setting themselves up as the center of, to somebody to be worshipped and adored, that is not a good sign. If somebody is clearly out for power, somebody is out for making a lot of money, these are all warning like red flags. So akamahata should not have any desire apart from my welfare, the students' welfare, students' enlightenment, nothing more than that. Then often in traditional India, the teachers would support the students. So instead of students paying, the students would pay something after they were done with the courses, whatever they felt they could. But till that point, the traditional novices would stay in the ashram with the guru. The guru would be responsible for housing and feeding them, apart from educating them. So that was a very good safeguard. Of course, it would be a very austere existence, but that was fine. And then the third qualification for an enlightened teacher would be Brahmanishta, which means centered in Brahman. So look at the life of the master. Is he a part-time guru or is he completely dedicated to the spiritual life? He or she, completely dedicated to the spiritual life. There should not be anything else in the life of that person. I mean, just the details of the life of that person. That person should be all about God or all about spirituality and nothing else. So these are good, checks, something that one can look for. A genuine part of a genuine tradition. One, no ulterior motive, none of the, the red flags of worldliness associated with the teacher. And third, complete dedication to the spiritual life. One more point I'd like to make is that the new generation of direct path teachers, my sense of at least some of them is that some of them are genuine. They have had spiritual breakthroughs. But then that's not enough to make somebody a teacher. This was well understood in ancient India. You must have something to transmit apart from your own awakening. And that requires a lot of spiritual practice and cultivation before you enter into teaching. Now, the effect of Advaita in America, Swami Vivekananda was the first traditional teacher to come to these shores, and he was a very powerful teacher. He came in 1893 in the World Parliament of Religions and then established these Vedanta societies and so on. A good book would be Phil Goldberg's American Veda, where he traces the impact of Vedanta on America. Going back before Vivekananda, he starts with the transcendentalists, with Emerson, with Thoreau, with Walt Whitman, And then he comes to Vivekananda, the Theosophical Society, and then especially the impact on American culture, popular culture. There's a chapter. The Swamis taught the smart guys, and the smart guys taught the rest of us. So where it talks about, for example, J.D. Salinger, the Catcher in the Rye, the novelist. He was a disciple of Swami Nikhilananda here in New York, and he quite frankly works Vedanta into some of his later novels. There is George Lucas and the whole Star Wars phenomenon, which through Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell again was a disciple of Swami Nikhilanandaji here. So mythology, the power of mythology, he worked a lot of ideas of Vedanta into Star Wars, the whole Star Wars franchise. But it's not just Vedanta, elements of multiple Eastern traditions, Buddhism included. Then there was Aldous Huxley, who wrote the Perennial Philosophy. Then there was Christopher Isherwood, Gerald Hurd, Houston Smith, who was a very noted scholar of comparative religion. Many people don't know that he was a disciple of Swami Satprakashananda in the Vedanta Society of St. Louis in Missouri. In this way, silently, over the first half to the middle part of the 20th century, a lot of Vedantic ideas found their way into American thought and popular culture, down to our modern Matrix movies and so on. So there are clear elements of ancient philosophy, Greek philosophy also, I must say, and of course, Buddhism and Vedanta there. Vivekananda, I'll just end with this. Vivekananda saw America as a spiritual enterprise. In American democracy, in human dignity, in freedom, he saw he says, when will Advaita Vedanta be a popular religion in India? It's doubtful, because India is a very ancient society with tremendous, like caste hierarchies and all, especially during Vivekananda's time. Over the last 100 years, democracy has had a very flattening effect on those hierarchies. But in America, he saw the possibility of a truly Vedantic society, where already you have the dignity of the human person. Now, what Vedanta does is root that dignity in our spiritual nature, not just in our biological or economic or political or social nature, but in our spiritual nature. The idea of oneness, the idea of sameness, equality, the idea of a rational religion which can, he says, which can withstand the challenge of science and modern atheism and skepticism. He saw Vedanta as an answer to all those challenges. So there you have it, America as a Vedantic nation.
Well, that's all very convincing, of course, with all of those ideals that you mentioned, which of course are very true and very valid and very much a part of American culture. You have counterpoised, just pure, simple greed and, almost the dynamic of American spiritual culture can be seen as a polarity between the ideals you've talked about and just plain old greed. And there's no better way to dignify it. So, but definitely that seems very apt. Well, we're coming to the end of our time, and you've gone through a huge amount, and it's been very enlightening, if I may say so. So I'm just wondering if you have any final comments or observations that we may not have covered over the last hour.
Yes, taking on from what you said, Vivekananda saw the greatness in America. In fact, he had a tendency of seeing the greatness in everybody, in not just nations, but also people, in religions. So he would always see it in the best possible light. Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet of India, Nobel laureate, he said about Vivekananda, in Vivekananda, everything is positive, nothing negative. So he would see every one of us in our best light. But he could be harshly critical too. As you just talked about greed, he would say that, he criticized Americans for the way dollar is king and sex is queen. So this dollar worship or this gross materialism, he was harshly critical of that, because that's the polar opposite of spirituality. In India, he was harshly critical of Indians for their casteism, the neglect of women, for their superstitious the vast amounts of superstition which prevailed. You have the highest philosophies, non-duality, you mentioned Sankhya, all of that is there. But if you, especially in Vivekananda's time, if you saw the popular religion of the masses, which was just a collection of rituals and few items of worship and local superstitions, and that's what passed for religion. He criticized Indians for our indolence and laziness and you know lack of initiative. So this is the point I want to end with. He thought of Vedanta specifically and spirituality in general as immensely practical. He in fact gave a series of lectures called Practical Vedanta. He said that I do not care for a religion which cannot wipe the widow's tears and lift a piece of bread to the mouth of a starving man and promises heaven after death. I do not care for such a religion. So it must have practical benefit, and that too for everybody in this world. It must leave everybody a little better off. Even if you're not enlightened at the end of it, you're at least physically, morally, intellectually, and spiritually better off. He wanted that kind of religion. And his point was, Vedanta is practical in the sense of the ideal, not in the sense of our, miserable practical existence now. He put it this way: don't drag down Vedanta to your dreary existence and, make it sound as if what we are right now is the ideal. No, rather drag yourself up, push yourself up to the Vedantic ideal. So the importance of struggle, not redescribing or reframing our present life as the ideal life. I am enlightened. I am without any practice, any sacrifice. I am Brahman. Well, no, that won't work. That's self-deception. So yeah, the practical in the sense of the ideal, to push yourself up to the ideal, not drag the ideal down to the gutter.
Well, that's very helpful and very fascinating. Well, this has been an extraordinary amount of material that you've given us over the past hour, and I'm personally very grateful for it. But we are coming to the end of our time, so I think we will conclude here, and I will just conclude with a very sincere thank you. I've learned an enormous amount.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you.